Hello everyone, welcome back to another podcast by DJ Anesh, the only podcast that is voted the best Southeast Asian podcast for JC1 in River Valley High School. Smashes the competition and there's no one to really compare with. We are miles ahead of our other competitors. So thank you for your loyal support. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for liking. I hope that with the new term, you guys will enjoy this series as well. Enjoy the classes, and with regards to all the things that's going on, the different arrangements and all that. Hope there'll be minimal disruption, and the teachers and myself will try our best to smoothen things out and to ensure that your learning is not disrupted in any way. So, welcome back to the podcast. We'll try to make this as entertaining as possible. Today, our focus for the podcast is we are going to be moving into the next topic in our study of Southeast Asia. And right now, we are moving from the point of independence. So, thus far, what we've covered, we've really looked at things like a bit of the colonial period, we looked at the Japanese occupation, we looked at the world in 1945, and then we looked at a period of decolonization. So that was all kind of the context, the build-up to what the state of Southeast Asia is like at the point of independence. Right now, our focus is going to be on politics, especially with this theme. It's very heavy on politics. And we are also going to be focused on the various forms of government and the idea of governance. So the forms of government, things to do with the structures, the system, the ideology that goes on in Southeast Asian politics. And the idea of governance is how one government controls and manages and takes care of the nation that is under its charge. So those are the things that we'll be dealing with. Today for this podcast and in the lecture that I did just now, the focus will really be on understanding some concepts to do with governance and to do with governments. And we won't be going too much into Southeast Asia at this point in time. It's just a bit with regards to some questions, but I really want you guys to get a clearer understanding of the concepts of democracy and authoritarianism, some key features, some essential elements to have before we go into the content of Southeast Asia as we contextualize it. The title you see over here, Leviathans and Behemoths, these are two terms that appear in the Bible, but they have also been used by this English philosopher. His name is Thomas Hobbes, and he uses them in his political writings. And these terms refer to a type of leader or a type of nation. And there is a slant when you call or when you term someone a Leviathan. It is more towards the authoritarian side of things. It is a pre-taste and a foreshadowing of how Southeast Asian politics are going to be shaped up. So we have experiments with democracy, we have our flirtation with authoritarianism and all that kind of stuff. And we just really want to understand how do these kind of political systems manifest in Southeast Asia? How are they localized? Are they really the same types of democracy and authoritarianism as other parts of the world? Have we combined elements to hybridize these political systems? What exactly were the forms of government that emerged, and why did they emerge that way? What were the factors of influence that shaped the politics of Southeast Asia from the point of independence? So that's just the opener, and it does set the context for what this lecture is going to be about. The most important thing whenever you all start a new topic or whenever you are going through a topic is to make sure that you are in check with the syllabus. So this slide contains information that is extracted from the syllabus document. I showed you guys how to read it. In particular, the headings of content, the learning outcomes, and the concepts, they're all over here. They're extracted out. So this will be the focus for this series of lectures, and we are looking at how and why nations establish different forms of governance. We are looking at the idea of parliamentary democracy, presidential democracy, authoritarianism in its various forms. Later on, we'll explore that a bit. And we are just going to analyze the different factors and the relationships that help to shape these kinds of forms of governments across Southeast Asia. The key concepts are looking at democracy, authoritarianism, and governance. Now, even as I go through this very simple slide on the syllabus document, you can see that there is no one-size-fits-all situation for Southeast Asia. The key concept in learning Southeast Asia and to undergo a regional study is to really hone in and anchor yourself in this concept of diversity. As Southeast Asia developed, there were various forms of governments that emerged because of the unique context, the unique circumstances that occurred within the different Southeast Asian nations. They had different experiences, different historical experiences that shaped the politics to what it was. And there are certain trends, there are certain patterns, there are certain similarities, but there are also certain differences. So these things, right, these four things, the trends, the patterns, the similarities, the differences across Southeast Asia, when we study all these things together, this is what we call comparative analysis. I think it would be a good idea right now for you guys to write this term down somewhere, because this term is something that is essential to our study of Southeast Asia, and it will last us through the entirety of the 2 years that we take all the way to the A-levels. So comparative analysis is looking at the region, trying to draw certain trends, certain patterns, certain similarities and differences, trying to group case studies together based on their similarities, and also distincting them from another set of case studies which exhibit different sets of characteristics. So you can see that Southeast Asia is really diverse, it is really complex, and which is why my initial encouragement to you all is that with every essay that we do, we can't just consider 3 case studies. I think that's too small a number. We have to aim for at least 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in order for you guys to really achieve the sophistication in comparative analysis. So do try for that. We may not reach there immediately, but over time with enough practice, I'm sure we'll get the hang of what comparative analysis is going to be all about. So the first thing that I want to talk to you guys about with regards to the concept is the concept of democracy. At this point in time, you can pause the podcast and you can think to yourself how you have encountered democracy in your own life. Maybe being under the Singapore government or in your own various experiences, even in school, in class, as you vote for the student council or as you choose your class chairperson or as you choose your subject representative or so on and so forth. Have you been engaged with a form of democracy? It may not be the full thing, but at least in its rudimentary form, have you been exposed to it and have you been experiencing it? And if you have, and I'm pretty sure you have, it would be a good idea right now to pause and to reflect and to think about what are the essential components of what makes a democracy. What are the key features? Things that are tangible, right? Things that you can see that would indicate that this is a functioning democracy. So these are things you can think about first. You can pause for a while and think about it before you continue on with the rest of the podcast. Okay, now with regards to the questions over here in this slide, it's just further prompting questions for you to get a sense of democracy and democracy in Southeast Asia. I think that these are questions that have no easy answers, and it probably won't be a one-liner kind of answer. There will be you can debate about this at length. Now, the first 2 questions over here, what are the essential components of democracy and what is the appeal of democracy as an ideology? Now, these first 2 questions over here, they are more theoretical. they are looking at democracy as an ideology, as an institution in general. So this can be these two questions, the answers can be applied to different contexts across different regions, across different time periods, and so on. So it will be a good idea to try to answer these questions for yourself as well. Especially the second one. What is the appeal of democracy as an ideology? As you reflect upon your current situation or contemporary times, the answers that you come up for yourself, let's see if they applied to the Southeast Asian context back in the day, back in the point of independence in the 1940s and 1950s. The last question is also an important one. What are some of the global circumstances and events influencing the appeal of democracy at Southeast Asia at that point in time? So the appeal of democracy might not just be inherent to the ideology, meaning to say that it's not just about the principles of democracy and all that. It could be certain external events or certain external circumstances that are influencing the appeal of democracy as well. So one of the big things I'm sure is on the top of your mind right now is, let's say, for instance, the Cold War. Now, the Cold War is, between two superpowers. There's bipolarity. One of the superpower is the foremost bastion of democracy at that point in time, and with their measure of influence, could that have influenced the appeal of democracy in Southeast Asia? So, by aligning yourself with the US, by subscribing to democratic principles, you are aligning yourself with the US, and through that you could gain some benefits, or you could face less opposition and resistance from the US and the Western allies, and so on and so forth. Basically, you can further your aims. It is beneficial for you as a Southeast Asian leader to subscribe to democracy because of the Cold War. So this is an example of how an external circumstance could influence the appeal of democracy as well. But with regards to the inherent qualities of democracy, there are some features that are appealing in general, but also at that point in time in Southeast Asian history. Now, over here in this slide, you can see the essential components of what constitutes democracy. Now, there can be more, but I think I've teased out the 5 biggest features of democracy. What makes a functioning democracy? So these are things that over time is consolidated, and nowadays, as a marker, as an indicator of democracy, you would need to see these things. For some people, the threshold is higher. You may need to see more things, or you may need to see all these things concurrently. Like, there can't be a compromise on any one of these pillars that you see over here. So let's go through some of these features and these pillars of democracy. The first one, I think, is the one that is the most visible, the most observable, and that is elections. In a democracy, is very, very associated with the idea of popular elections. So just the term elections itself might not be enough. You may need to consider that the elections must be popular, meaning to say that a good percentage of the voting population, a good percentage of the population would get to vote. There wouldn't be very shady kind of marginalization or suppression of certain groups of people. It is a fair and equal process. So that's something to attach to your idea of elections, that it has to be popular, it has to be fair. And the last one I would include to associate with elections is that it has to be frequent. Now, frequent doesn't mean, every day let's go to the voting booth and all that. No, it doesn't mean that. Frequent means that with what is provided by in the law, and the law in this case you can see here is called the Constitution. With what is provided for in the Constitution, you have to abide by that frequency of elections. So usually the case is that elections are held once every 4 to 5 years, barring any extraordinary events. So let's say, for instance, Singapore, once every 4 to 5 years. The current parliament would expire by January 2021. So by then, Singapore has to call for elections by the rule of law, by the constitution. So you can see some principles of democracy here, besides the elections being free, being fair, being frequent, being popular, but also that it is governed by a set of laws and collectively known as the constitution. So you can see that there is one key component about democracy. There's a lot of check and balance. There's a lot of accountability with regards to these kind of legal matters. Quite closely connected to the first pillar, we can see the right to vote and constitutional safeguards to ensure sound electoral processes. Now, what this means is the first part is that those eligible to vote will get the opportunity to vote, and when going to vote and with their vote itself, there will be safeguards to ensure that their vote matters or their vote will be counted. So there won't be like some shady thing going on where, oh, you know, the box of voting is the box of votes are lost, or some online failure, or like some misplaced ballot boxes, or you know, that kind of stuff. Like, there are sound constitutional processes to ensure that your vote will be counted and it will matter to the end result. Usually in this case, the authorities will get involved. There's the involvement of the police, election authorities, and so on and so forth. So it's just ensuring and safeguarding the whole voting process, that your vote matters. But the idea of the vote itself is something really important, because a key component of democracy has to do with power and where power lies. In a democracy, more than any other political system, the dispersion of power to the people, or what we call the devolution of power to the people, is greater than other forms of governments. So with that right to vote, actually there's a lot of transference of political power to the people, because they are going to be choosing a representative government. Now, this government is of the people, it's by the people, and hopefully it will be for the people. So that's something that democracy has massive appeal over, which is giving people the power. So you hear things like, oh, people power movements, or you hear things like power to the people. This is all about the devolution of power. That power is, in a sense, shared. It isn't too concentrated in any one particular party. So that's the core concept of power in a democratic setting. The third one, as I mentioned, constitutional law. The law plays a big part of it, and governments themselves, even the Prime Minister or the President, they have to abide by constitutional law. What is set out in the Constitution, they have to abide by it. It is kind of their legitimacy, and it is kind of their morality as well. Because if they are seen to disregard the Constitution, or if they are seen to engage in things outside of the Constitution, against the Constitution, then it wouldn't reflect very well on them, and their credibility would be questioned. So there's another that is another check and balance, that is another safeguard in a democratic setting. The fourth one is the key institution of a democracy. Now, the key institution of the democracy is a parliament. And the parliament is where the major decision-making processes are being played out. So politicians would come to the parliament, they'll debate on certain bills, certain amendments, and so on and so forth, until it gets passed into the law. Now, this again is another safeguard, because you're ensuring that there is proper check and balance, there is proper debate on any decisions before they are implemented. So it does give a measure of guarantee, it does give a measure of assurance that things are done by consensus and things are done in the name of the people and through debate instead of something more arbitrary. And the last one here, individual freedoms and an active civil society. Now, this one is a bit controversial because some people would not view this as essential to what constitutes a democracy. So, for instance, a democracy can have the first four elements but be more restrictive on civil society. So they can impose, let's say, more censorship, more laws that restrict certain things, and so on and so forth. So Singapore has been accused of that, right? Because Singapore fulfills the first four components. I think there's no question about that. But the fifth component here, Singapore has some question marks over, especially when the West views Singapore. Personally, this is up to you. It is your own political standing. It is your own political view. How much of this affects your judgment of democracy is kind of up to you. For me, I think it's still within the bounds that even though we have restrictions in society, I think we are still a functioning democracy. We massively fulfill all the other components, and we do things in the spirit of democracy as well. The restrictions on civil society, I think that they have their own purpose. And in fact, I think that the purpose there is to safeguard democracy. So that's something that it seems paradoxical, but we'll explore that further in our classes with this topic. So these are the 5 components. There may be more, you can include it, it's not exhaustive, but I think these are the 5 biggest components of a democracy. And I hope that going through these 5 pillars or these 5 features, you can start to see a bit more about why democracy can be appealing, number 1. But more importantly for us, why democracy can be appealing for Southeast Asia at the point of independence. You take a look at the last question, going back one slide, the third question over here. What is the appeal of democracy in the context of newly independent Southeast Asia? Now you take a look at all these features once again, you can see that Southeast Asia, having been under some form of alien control for the bulk of the past 200 years, either through the Western colonial powers or later the Japanese, and then later the Western colonial powers again, I think this concept of freedoms, power, rights, individuality, unique expressions, all these kind of things are really appealing to them as they forge their new nations. So that would account a lot for why almost all Southeast Asian nations, when they got to the point of independence, their first form of government were democracies. Whether or not those democracies did well or how effective were those democracies, we'll debate that at a later time. But I just want you to get an understanding as to why, despite having almost no authentic experience with democracy during the colonial period or during the Japanese occupation, Southeast Asia, the governments still chose democracy as their first form of government. So that's something interesting, and that's something I want you all to investigate a bit further. There's only one country that did not really go into, a full-fledged democracy, and that was Vietnam, who had a really strong communist movement over there. So that's a unique exception, a different story over there. And that's a good segue into our next kind of ideology system. But it's at the other end of the spectrum. We're looking at authoritarian forms of control. Same questions that I want you all to consider. And again, even if you want to go back to think about how your class chairperson was chosen, or your subject representatives, or I don't know about like whatever else kind of elections that you have been through, but were there some form of authoritarianism embedded in it? And when your class chairpersons and your subject representatives and who else, like people like your fellow peers who are in positions of power, how do they govern you? Is it based on democracy? Do they put you to a consensus, or is it more authoritarian forms of control where they have they are decisive in their own regard and they make their own choices in the interest of you guys and just present it to you in that way? So what kinds of forms of governance have you been under lately? But in this case, it's about authoritarianism. And you can think about that. You can pause here also, and you can think about authoritarianism, what it means to you. Have you encountered it in your various forms of life, in school or outside? The questions that you see over here in this slide are the same questions as what we saw before in the democracy one. It's basically about looking at the different features of authoritarianism. Why is it appealing? And in Southeast Asian context, why is it appealing as well? Now, this set of questions is the same as just now, but I think that these set of questions are questions that we don't think about often enough. Very often we view authoritarianism with a negative lens, and I think we've been conditioned to see authoritarian forms of control as repressive and evil and so on and so forth. I think there is that perspective, definitely, but I think that we need to balance it out and consider mitigating factors, or we need to contextualize why authoritarian forms of control are implemented in the first place. I mean, surely there must be a context for that, and surely that context must be to serve some purpose. So yeah, the idea of what is the appeal of authoritarianism, and especially what is the appeal of authoritarianism for Southeast Asia at the early phase of independence, is something for you all to consider. Now, you can see over here the diagrammatic representation of the authoritarian features is quite distinct from the one that you saw with democracy. I chose this visual representation because I think it quite aptly captures what authoritarianism is about, especially with regards to power. Power radiates from the center. This center is usually a small, close group of people, and they are the decision makers. In terms of where power lies, it's very much concentrated in the center. It diffuses out to the concentric circles, but not to the degree you see in a democracy. With regards to the features, sometimes there may be elections. There may even be a parliament. But the authenticity and the genuinity of these institutions or these processes, it has to be questioned, because they may not be as genuine or authentic as what you see in normal functioning democracies. If they are there, they must serve some purpose as well, even though they are questionable. And usually they are there in order to provide more legitimacy for the authoritarian government. So in a sense, it's like a show. It is a performance. And these elections are questionable because they are heavily rigged, or there's a lot of skew or slant. There's a lot of repression of the opposition and so on and so forth. The parliament may be there, but it's what we call a rubber stamp parliament, which is that the parliament doesn't really debate, they just toe the government's line or what the government has decided upon. So a lot of these kind of things are there to serve some sort of legitimizing purpose. But in terms of the authenticity and whether power is really given to these institutions and these processes, there's something to be heavily questioned. Usually it's by arbitrary law, and usually the authoritarian governments would lean towards repressive forms of control. Repressive forms of control, most ostensibly, it could be the military, the police. I mean, they are inclined to use those kind of mechanisms and institutions. But it also could be something like, let's say, the media, censorship. It could even be the use of the law, instituting into the law some very harsh punishments for certain offenses. So these are the kind of things that authoritarian governments lean towards more. And so as a consequence, the last point over here, because of these amendments and these constitutional changes and the kind of style, the philosophy of their governance, there may be a consequence of a lack of civil liberties, meaning to say that our individual freedoms and our societal freedoms are curtailed. They are restricted in some manner especially in comparison to democracies. So, despite these features, again, the third question is the important one. What is the appeal of authoritarianism in the context of newly independent Southeast Asia? So, these features, I want you to remove all the authoritarianism is evil, authoritarianism is bad kind of lens for a moment. And I want you to ask if there is a context for why authoritarianism might be appealing to Southeast Asian nations in the early phases of independence. I just now said that most governments chose democracy as their first form of government, sure. But spoiler alert, going down the line, many of these democracies do not survive. They morph, they evolve, they change into authoritarian regimes. Now, what's the appeal of authoritarianism? What's the context of Southeast Asia that allows authoritarianism to survive? These are things for you to consider. And again, removing the lens of it's evil, it's bad, it's not good for people, blah, blah, blah. Like removing all those lens, right? Try to understand, to contextualize why governments would adapt or change their governments, their style of governance into authoritarian forms. So that's a challenge for you guys. We will go into the case studies in due time, and we'll explore all these key questions as well. Now, there is a chart for you guys. It's colored, and I hope by the time you listen to this, you'll have it with you. I want you guys to take a look at it, the chart, and the legend is over here with regards to what do the colors represent. I just want to go through a bit of it. Light green, the colonial period, I think that's okay. Blue is various forms of democracy, so that's okay. Now, orange, you can see it in the Indonesia section. And the orange is seen in both the Sukarno and the Suharto regimes, actually lasting for the bulk of Indonesian politics. Now, the orange part here is this. Now, what does it mean? Okay, firstly, what does it mean to have a maximum government? A maximum government is another term to indicate an authoritarian government. So the two terms are quite interchangeable in that sense. Why is the term maximum government there in the first place? Because of the idea of maximum control. So that's why you call them maximum governments, because authoritarian forms of governments usually they have quite a large degree of control over society, over the individual lives of the citizens. So that's what a maximum government is. Now for the orange part over here, what is a civilian maximum government? That means to say that this authoritarian government, the leaders, the people in power, the prime minister, the president, they are all civilian politicians. They are not from the military, right? These are civilian politicians. They are not army generals. They are not navy admirals or whatever. They are civilian politicians. But why I've termed them as orange is because in these societies, especially the Sukarno and the Suharto regimes, that the military does play a heavy influence in the politics. Meaning to say that the military, even though they may not have the highest of posts in the arena of politics, but they do have a huge influence on these people, on the president, on the prime minister, on the cabinet, on the decision makers of the country. So that is the situation for the orange one in Indonesia. Now this is a bit different from the red ones that you see in Burma, in Cambodia, in Thailand. Now the red ones here are military maximum governments. Now this term indicates that the government is the military. That means to say the government, from the leader to the cabinet, the members of the government, they are mostly, if not all, from the military. So the president or the prime minister could be a 3-star, 4-star general, for instance, something like that. This is where there's no pretense to it. The military is the government. So those are the red color countries you can see in the chart. Yellow is the communist government. That one I think quite self-explanatory. And dark green. Now dark green is another one I need to explain. Dark green is what we call the civilian maximum government. Now the dark green countries, you can see I put it as Malaya, Singapore, and Philippines at some parts. Now why is it dark green and what is a civilian maximum government? It's quite like the Indonesia case, but just that the military doesn't hold as much influence as what we saw in Indonesia. The dark green one okay, so why I put them as dark green is because the choice, I can still leave it up to you. These countries and these regimes, do you consider them democracies? Can they still fall under the category of democracy? Or for you, it veers into maximum government and authoritarian governments? I think why I put them in dark green is because most of them fulfill the conditions of democracy. But there are some discrepancies and there are some absence of certain elements to democracy. So, like the Singapore case that I gave you just now, we may fulfill most of the components, but because there are huge question marks over the degree of our civil liberties, individual freedoms, that kind of stuff. So there's question marks over the nature of our democracy. So the dark green ones, personally, I would still see them as illiberal democracies. So they largely conform to democratic standards, but there's a measure of illiberalism towards them. Illiberal is just the opposite of liberal. So there's some form of restriction or whatever. But I leave the choice up to you. Again, this is not my view that matters, it's yours. You can discover your own political spectrum and your own political leanings. Yeah, so I think that covers it for all the colors. And the questions that I really want you all to think about when you stare at this chart is these three questions that you see over here. Remember at the start of this podcast, I talked to you guys about this thing called comparative analysis. Looking at trends, patterns, similarities, differences across Southeast Asia. So this is exactly, this map gives you, that extent of diversity and the wealth of difference in Southeast Asia. There are many similarities, there are many differences. I want you guys to think about them. And more importantly, I want you to try to account for them. To think about why did these trends emerge? What accounts for these patterns? So I want you all to think about these kind of things as you look at the map. We will discuss them in tutorials this week. And the last thing I have for you guys is we may not be able to answer this question now, but we are building up to this question in this current series of lectures and tutorials. Assess the significance of decall in shaping the various forms of government in the period of early independence. So right now you have quite a bit of information on decall, the experiences over there, and the state that it left Southeast Asia in. But now as we go on to this content about the forms of governments that emerged in Southeast Asia after independence, at the early phase of independence, now we need to start to make the connections. What was it about the decall experience that resulted in these political developments after independence? So it is not a question that I think you can answer now, but you can keep this question in mind and we will continually revisit it as we uncover more and more of the content. Okay, so thanks guys for listening to this podcast. Welcome back to term 2. I'm glad to see all of you all again. Please stay healthy. Please do the necessary. Take care of one another. Take care of yourself. And I will see you guys in tutorials. Okay, thanks for listening.